Okay, so before we get started, I'll perhaps just go ahead quickly and introduce everyone. The session description is online. We're going into session one of our conference following the opening keynote, looking at NOCs versus IOCs, changing dynamics as net zero ambitions multiply. And I'll go ahead and introduce the speakers very briefly, and I'll share the full bios with you all in the chat as well. So I'll start with by alphabetical order with Michael Cohen, who is joining us. I think Michael was with us for the first conference. So I don't know if he was with us for all 7 years, but good to have you back with us, Michael, again. He is the chief U.S. economist and head of oil and refining for BP's strategy and sustainability group. In this role, he is responsible for short, medium, and long-term oil market and U.S. policy analysis that informs BP's leadership team, the BP Energy Outlook, and the Statistical Review. Prior to joining BP in May 2019, he was Barclays Global Head of Commodities Research, responsible for preparing and delivering differentiated research on commodities markets to Barclays' global corporate and institutional investor client base. He worked for a decade in the public sector as an economist for the U.S. Energy Information Administration and the Department of Energy's Office of Policy and International Affairs, and as a senior member of the Oil Markets Division at the International Energy Agency. Welcoming also Dr. Valérie Marcel, who is the Associate Fellow, Environment and Society Program at Chatham House. She is the project lead for the New Producers Group, the South-South knowledge sharing network of 30 emerging oil and gas producer countries. She is an established expert on national oil companies, petroleum sector governance, and emerging strategic issues shaping the energy sector. She is an author of Oil Titans, National Oil Companies in the Middle East, published by Chatham House Brookings Institution in 2006. Also with us, our good friend Adam Sieminski, the Senior Advisor to the Board of Trustees of the King Abdullah Petroleum Studies and Research Center. He served as the President of CAPSARC from 2018 to August 2021. Prior to joining CAPSARC, he held the James Schlesinger Chair for Energy and Geopolitics at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Prior to that, he was a non-resident senior advisor to the CSIS Energy and National Security Program and served as the administrator of the U.S. Energy Information Administration from 2012 to 2017. Moderating the session today is non-resident fellow at AGSIW, Kate Dorian. She is also a contributing editor for the Middle East Economic Survey and a fellow at the Energy Institute. Previously, she was the regional manager for the Middle East and Gulf states at the World Energy Council, as well as the program officer for the Middle East and North Africa in the Global Energy Relations Division of the International Energy Agency. I want to specifically thank Kate for her help again for the 7th year in a row organizing this conference, for her thought leadership, especially in putting together the scene setter, which we shared with you previously. And I will share again with the chat for those who are joining us for this session. And with that, Kate, I'll hand this over to you.
Thank you very much, Raymond. Welcome all. I'm so happy to have the three of you because we have Adam Sieminski, who's been in Saudi Arabia for a long time, which is home to, I guess, the mother of NOCs, Saudi Aramco. We have Valérie Marcel, who, since I met you years and years ago, you've been known as an expert on national oil companies. And of course, Michael Cohen, who has now switched to the private sector at BP. So I think we've got excellent views. I've just flown back. In fact, just less than 2 hours ago, I landed from Iceland, where, as we know, they use a lot of geothermal, and they're very proud of the fact that they don't use any fossil fuels anymore, which they used to, a decade or two ago. I come to France, where the majority of their electricity generation is from nuclear, even though gas prices, sky-high gas prices have actually affected electricity prices, and all my friends are complaining about it. So I'm in Paris now. Tomorrow I go to the UK, home, and where our Prime Minister is making sure that everybody hears about his efforts to conserve energy ahead of COP26. We're going to be giving incentives for people not to use so much electricity, to switch to EVs and so on. So I think, and that's one of the points I think I made in the piece, that it's a very disjointed kind of transition. You know, it isn't even, it isn't equal in all continents, so different countries even within the EU. So I think that's, but we are in transition, and Adam, I get your point. We are slowly moving into the transition. It's not a rapid transition, but it is accelerating. So I wanted to know where the Middle East and Petro states actually stand. You know, do they have transition pathways? And I'm going to start with you, Adam, first, as discussed, as somebody who's actually been in Saudi Arabia, was involved in government in the US. So please, your perspective on the NOCs in a net zero world.
You know, I think that's a great question, and I want to thank you very much, Kate, for the opportunity to talk, and of course the Arab Gulf states in Washington. There are real projects underway here that fit into the net zero concept that has everybody energized and is clearly going to be the focus of COP26 in Glasgow. I think that to me, one of the interesting things is how there are many different pathways towards net zero, and net zero is a very different word than zero. There are a lot of people who seem to think that we can have 100% renewables, that we don't need oil and gas anymore, and I think that that's highly, highly unlikely. There are so many places that are really hard to decarbonize. Aviation, for example, heavy transportation, whether it's trucking or marine, a lot of industrial heat applications and so on, chemicals. So the list goes on. To me, there's a really interesting divide. I mean, we're talking today about the national oil companies and the international oil companies and how they might approach this differently. But it seems that there's another divide that's opening up as well, and that's between companies who want to move away from hydrocarbons and companies who want to manage the emissions that are coming from their hydrocarbons. So I think that the pathway that Saudi Arabia and Saudi Aramco is on is one that says it's not carbon that's the problem, it's fugitive carbon is the problem, and that we have to manage the fugitive carbon. And that can be done in a number of different ways. So I'll just very quickly go through some of the projects that are underway, Kate, and I come back to you. You know, people talk about the reduce and the circular economy. There are big energy efficiency programs underway, and some of these are nationwide auto fuel efficiency standards, for example, and air conditioning appliance standards. But Saudi Aramco itself has a tremendous efficiency program underway for how they produce their oil and natural gas. There is a huge green hydrogen project underway at NEOM. Aramco has one of the two carbon capture enhanced oil recovery projects underway in the region. The other one is, of course, in Abu Dhabi. But the CO2 is being captured at the Hawiyah gas plant and is being used in enhanced oil recovery. SABIC has a big program underway in using CO2 for methanol production in food and beverages, refrigeration, and so on. There's also a program that's starting up at SABIC that will be scaled up to use CO2 in ethylene glycol production. Saudi Aramco is actually looking, they were the first to have a shipment of blue ammonia, so ammonia with CO2 recovered and used. Some of it used by SABIC and some of it used in enhanced oil recovery by Aramco. But blue hydrogen went to ammonia, went to Japan. There's also a big effort on in the area of dealing directly with CO2 that's currently in the air. There's a big tree planting program underway by Aramco. I think you'll hear more about that at the Saudi Green Initiative this weekend. And Aramco is also involved in restoring mangroves. They're pursuing direct air capture options. So these, I think that it's pretty clear to me that that there are a number of national oil companies, Saudi Aramco is among them, who understand the need to lead in providing solutions that will help to deal with the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. And there are real projects with real money behind them underway in the kingdom to do that. Thanks, Kate.
Thank you, Adam. We'll come back to this later on because we heard His Excellency say, ammonia is not really easy to transport. We also have the cost of hydrogen. We have, all the added costs of actually decarbonizing hydrocarbons. So I think that's a subject to come later on, and it fits into the how the NOCs are going to be making their money if they're not going to be exporting oil and maybe less gas in the future. Valérie, I'm going to come to you because I heard you speak recently and you said, and the gist of it was that not all NOCs are equal. So some will be winners, some will be losers, some are somewhere in the middle, but that they don't really have a transition pathway that is very clear. So maybe you can speak to us a little bit more generally about NOCs. I know we have Aramco, we have ADNOC, which are sort of leading the drive in the region, and on the other side of the continent there's Morocco. But other than that, maybe you can give us an overview of where the NOCs stand in this transition.
Thanks for that. I mean, what a great setup to talk about, to hear Adam talk about Saudi Aramco, which is doing so well in this area. But I think clearly that's not the general picture for NOCs, and I think it's interesting to talk about winners and losers because we will see a lot of losers, I think, in this transition. We all know that the lowest cost producer is the last NOC standing, but does that mean that the highest cost producer will be the first to go, the first to drop? Perhaps it would actually be the highest emitter NOC. So, I think if we look at the carbon intensity per barrel of oil produced, we see that the most intensive is Algeria, followed by Venezuela, Cameroon, Canada, Iran, Turkmenistan, Indonesia, Sudan, Trinidad and Tobago, and Iraq. So a lot of these countries are, their production is dominated by their NOC. So this is definitely an NOC story. And the intensity of that production is partly due to the molecules themselves. The crude Venezuela heavy oil, of course, explains a part of that. But it's also attributable to the way that they're managing their sector and the kind of concern that they have for introducing renewables throughout the value chain, for controlling methane leakage, for thinking about how you select a project on the basis of an emissions profile rather than just not be concerned about that. I think part of it is also due to the political leadership. And if you think of Sonatrach, well, it had a fantastic transformation strategy. But its CEOs have been changed every couple of months. So that really impedes a company's ability to completely refocus. Of course, PDVSA has huge problems of political leadership. And so I think that's important, the directives you get from higher up in terms of where you focus. But I think part of the blame goes also to the fact that a lot of NOCs have not focused enough on internal operational excellence. Are they focused on monitoring costs and emissions real time? Most don't even have a real-time view of that. So let alone a baseline assessment of emissions. So, I think that there's a real operational shift that needs to happen in some of these companies. So I think, that differentiates some of these NOCs, certainly. But I think, if we think of carbon price most likely to rise over the next few years, I mean, just thinking of the European Union's import duty on high emissions oil and gas, their production isn't going to be worth as much on international markets. So it really makes them more vulnerable. So as they drop off, do we see more room made for the new producers, like the Ghanaian National Oil Company? Their production is very low intensity, but it doesn't mean that they're really going to be, the dominant players. You probably will see a much more oligopolistic market dominated by the GCC NOCs. They rise in international power and domestic power, and that's certainly going to shape the scene. But I've been talking sort of at an international level, and I think to your point earlier, Kate, that the energy transition is going to happen at different speeds in different regions. And so while we may have an international carbon price, emerging, it may not be touching certain regions that are thinking about it differently. So you may have also more NOCs that are focused on domestic consumption, like we heard from Bahrain. So companies, NOCs that are focusing on domestic production, they lose the ability to produce rent, excessive profit well above the cost of inputs. Same thing for NOCs that go really into renewables. Renewables make profit, but they don't make rent. So all of those NOCs are really going to lose their power domestically and on the international stage. And you could see that it would really lead to a redefining of the political contract in places like Venezuela, Algeria, Iraq, and also in the GCC, if for countries like maybe Bahrain and Oman, if they're focused more on domestic consumption. So I think that's it shows a picture where, yes, we'll have some winners, the lowest cost and the lowest emission NOCs like Saudi Aramco and ADNOC and QP, and the losers that I've mentioned. But in between them, there's 100 NOCs with different variety of situations and quite uncertain prospects.
That's great, because yes, I mean, we keep saying the NOCs are going to have to step up because the IOCs, or the international energy companies, as they're known mostly these days, are stepping back from investment in hydrocarbon, which is where Michael Cohen comes in. Michael, I also heard you speak recently, and there was a debate about peak demand. Is it 2030? Is it beyond 2030? And of course, when you keep coming up with these predictions of peak demand, which, it's a moving target, do you, why should people invest in oil and gas if that's the case? But you also mentioned that about 50 countries, peak oil demand has already arrived. Maybe you could, and you didn't elaborate at the time, so maybe we can talk more about, what's actually happening in the oil and gas world.
Sure. Thanks, Kate, and thank you to AGSIW for welcoming me back. It's always a pleasure to participate in this conference, and I'm really honored to be on this panel with people that I respect and have worked with over many years. So thank you. The first question you mentioned, Kate, in terms of why people should or should not continue to invest in oil and gas. It's clear that advantaged hydrocarbons will have a place in the future supply mix. And what those advantaged hydrocarbons look like, they will clearly have a lower carbon or GHG intensity than the suite of hydrocarbons that are produced today. And that will come as a result of importing countries enacting both implicit or explicit taxes or in some form, pricing the externality of the intensity of the process. And as Valérie mentioned, the highest forms of carbon intensity crudes, there's been a lot of work that's been done on this, and yes, many of those countries, and producers are being produced with NOCs as being at the helm of that production. But the thing to keep in mind is that the analysis that has addressed what that carbon intensity looks like today is treated as static over time. And in reality, I think we need to see this as an opportunity. And those carbon intensities and GHG intensities will evolve over time as the world and as society shifts to valuing this in addition to cost, valuing the carbon intensity as an attribute. When we look out at all of our different scenarios, it's clear that, not just from the scenarios that we do within BP's Energy Outlook, but also if you look at the IEA's World Energy Outlook that came out just last week, forecasting for the first time, at least in the STEP scenario, a peak in oil demand in 2030 to 2040. When you look at IHS's scenarios, WoodMac scenarios as well, there are peaking or plateauing of oil demand. Now, irrespective of whatever you adopt as your own view, whether it's the plateau, the decline, or the sharp declines that could be needed in a net zero aligned scenario, in the next several years, we need to see continued hundreds of billions of dollars of investment in oil and gas in order to offset the declines from existing fields. That's the first thing I would say. And it's just a matter of where that marginal dollar of investment goes. Is it going to go into just the lowest cost assets, or is it going to go into both the lowest cost and low carbon intensity assets? The other thing that is I think absent from the debate is, should that marginal dollar go towards continuing to invest in an existing field, or should it go into a new field? An existing field might become more and more carbon intensive over time as the span or the geographic footprint of that field expands and expands, or should a new field with low exploration risk, with a low oil and gas ratio, with a high recovery rate, should that be the recipient of that marginal dollar? And I would suggest for debate that there will be some value in continued exploration and continued investment in new fields, not just in existing fields, because they will grow more carbon intensive over time. So to wrap this up in terms of the oil demand issue, we are seeing right now a clear mismatch in terms of incremental investment and the rebound in oil demand that we're seeing as a result of the outcome of this pandemic. A growth of 6% in GDP, record kinds of levels that we haven't seen for many, many years. And so we're bound to see this mismatch in terms of supply and demand. So that's the key right now, is that in the short term, we're investing like we're preparing for a net zero kind of scenario. And in reality, the supply-demand balance is something that's far different from that, and that's why we're seeing these price impacts. Over the long term, and this is part of why we have adopted the strategy that we have, we see in almost all scenarios a decline in oil as the dominant fuel mix. Electrification and transport is driving this, increased recycling in petrochemicals, reduced use of oil in industry and buildings, increased amount of efficiency. And so oil increasingly will have to compete with gas, with renewables, in order to supply energy demand. And so I think that kind of sums up why we've undertaken the strategy that we have, and I'm happy to talk more about that in Q&A. But hopefully that gives a sense of the peaking issue over the long term and short term.
Thank you. I'm going to go back to you, Adam, and we've spoken about the things that Aramco is doing. And when I go to Saudi Arabia, I say you do wonderful things, and you do have a lot of, you put a lot into research and development, and yes, direct air capture and hydrogen and electric vehicles, and there's a lot going on. But the world looks at Saudi Arabia, the Middle East as a whole, as it's all about oil. I think there's a reputational issue. I don't think they're getting their message across. And in fact, the UAE, I think, is the only country that has actually declared a net zero target, which Saudi Arabia might do. Yes, you were going to go back to the trees because that's part of the, that's part of the effort. But don't you need water? And I mean, where's the water going to come from? Are you using solar for desalination? Are you getting artesian? I mean, it's very difficult to see because obviously the Middle East is going to be, the Gulf states are going to be very affected by climate change. We've already seen, extreme heat this summer, I think. So what can these countries do to actually convince consumers? Because at the end of the day, the consumer may have to pay more for decarbonize, for a carbon neutral product. But the messaging, I think, is missing. And there is still that people recoil when you say, Saudi Aramco, say, oh, God, dirty oil. And you think, actually, you don't know enough because maybe they don't get their message across that well. Do you think that's a problem?
Well, there was some fairly decent messaging that came out of the G20 last year that was hosted by Saudi Arabia. The G20 ministers endorsed the idea of the circular carbon economy, the idea of using all options. I mean, there's really nothing magic about this. It's just a way of thinking about the circular economy and making sure that carbon kind of fits into that concept. You have reduce, reuse, and recycle, and then remove. And the idea is to value all of those contributions. What the G20 summit leaders said a year ago was that it was important to acknowledge, and I think I heard Kate and Valérie mention this, that there's more than one pathway to net zero, and that, Kate, I think you had a great quote in the report that you wrote, the paper that. And I see Raymond put a link up to your paper. I would encourage everybody that's listening in today to click on that link and download the paper. That it's going to require more than just one fuel, your favorite, whatever that is, to one source of energy to get to the goals of the Paris Agreement. Let me come back to the messaging thing. I think Saudi Arabia is involved right now in a nationwide program to try to implement the ideas behind hitting on all of the options. I mentioned that efficiency is underway, hydrogen is underway, renewables are underway. There's a goal, it's a stretch goal, but to get half of the electricity production in Saudi Arabia being provided by renewables, probably mostly solar panels. By 2030. So it's not like the reduced side, the renewable side is being ignored. I think the reality is it's really critical, and those things have probably provided the bulk of the benefits that we've seen so far in reducing carbon, but it's just not enough. It's like mathematicians or scientists would say it's necessary but not sufficient. So you come back to. I wanted to emphasize why I think this is important. Two reasons. Valérie mentioned that not all of the national oil companies or countries have the same ability to deal with this issue, either economically or technologically. And one of the things that seems to be missing in many of the studies about how we get to net zero are the geopolitical implications. What happens in the countries that Valérie mentioned that are at the top of that list of carbon intensity, what happens geopolitically there, and what does that mean on a global basis? And I see very few people addressing that, and I'm delighted to hear Valérie talk about it. And Michael mentioned the improvements that in energy intensity that could lead to a decline in oil demand. And for all of the reasons that he stated, but I think you have to be very careful. Oil's share of total energy might go down, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the number of barrels that we need will go down. And the reason that for that is that the population growth and economic growth in countries that don't have enough energy, even hydrocarbons, we may see it go up. There's 2 billion people in the world. There's a really great graphic in the IEA's World Energy Outlook that shows the number of people that don't have clean cooking fuels. It's more than 2 billion. And it also shows how the easiest kind of way to deliver clean cooking fuels is propane, which is a fossil fuel, right? So I think that the possibilities that we may see more automobiles being powered by internal combustion engines that use gasoline or diesel fuel out in the future is real. So I think we have to deal with the emissions issue under a view that says that if we don't, that you are likely to see, not meeting the Paris goals or creating a geopolitical. I'd love to know what the IEA's views is on the geopolitics of a world where there's only 40 million barrels a day of oil production. They haven't said. So back to you, Kate.
It was interesting what you said about propane and cooking. I think the IEA did a special study on Morocco, and the Moroccans actually, love to cook with propane. They don't particularly like to switch to electric or anything else because their cuisine depends on it. But I want to get now.
Kate, this isn't switching from, to it's getting off of wood or animal manure, biomass. Right, and if you have to do that with propane because that's the easiest way to do it, that's a good moral case for delivering that fuel to people.
Because what you talked about is sort of a source of indoor pollution, lots of deaths, particularly in Africa, where they cook indoors. But you also mentioned geopolitics, and I want to get to Valérie, because you said, renewables might generate profit, but not rent. So obviously there's a sort of geopolitical, these countries that a lot of them in the Middle East had been sort of rentier states or that depended on oil revenues. And I think even now they still do in order to sort of fund the transition away from, or at least to lessen the share of fossil fuels as a revenue generator. Do you see a sort of potential for some of these countries to not be able to honor their social contracts, for example, because of a decline in rents?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's a really big question. Clearly, so, I think we actually, if you look at a backward chart of company profits over the last 5 years, renewables do better than the oil and gas sector, but that's for private companies. For NOCs, they are able to reap the full rent, or at least it comes through them and is directed to Treasury. And so I think, yes, when they are no longer able to, when they redirect their efforts to renewables, they see really declining profits. But equally, I think, while we're seeing a boom in price of oil now, and we'll probably see a lot of volatility up and down, boom and bust, but then the long-term structural expected impact is a lowering of oil price. And so you wouldn't, the ability to produce rent from the sector will just broadly decline as well, even for those last NOC standing that I mentioned. So yes, I think that has a massive impact on countries that are especially the first to be affected. So in the countries that have more time to manage their transition, there's more time to invest in diversification, in different programs to refocus skills on different sectors. But with less money to do so, it becomes a greater and greater problem. So it's really a question of anticipating these changes and making the economic policy changes, making the NOC strategy changes before you're out of revenues to fund your transition, and to invest in low carbon, to manage all that. And I think one other thing to point out is also that while a lot of the low-income countries that would like to be investing in low-carbon pathways are not getting enough funding. The sort of promised green finance of $100 billion plus what's coming from private investors isn't going to NOCs to help them with low carbon sustainable oil production. It's not going to these countries either for funding their renewables. So if you're not getting that low carbon investment and you're struggling to produce the rent that you used to know, yes, I think there's going to be some serious turmoil in the first countries to fall victim to the transition.
Thank you, Valérie. Michael, I'm going to come to you. We haven't really spoken about one of the major events in the oil world, oil and gas, that basically shook up the global oil market, which was shale in the United States. And I was wondering whether you could give us an idea of what is actually going on in the shale patch. We're seeing, oil prices have been at, 3-year highs on Brent and 7-year highs on TI. And, maybe, and where BP stands in that market.
Sure. So, as I mentioned, we're seeing this severe mismatch between supply and demand right now. And one of the contributors to that mismatch is an increasing investor demand for capital discipline. And some of that is related to, over time, increasing concerns related to ESG. But I would say primarily it's just a focus on increasing returns to shareholders. And over the last several years, shareholders in shale and U.S. E&Ps have been burned. They've believed that these returns would increase, and in a sense, U.S. E&Ps have not been a good investment, to be simple here. And so over the last 3 to 5 years, in increasing amounts, investors have demanded a rethink of the capital structure of the U.S. E&P industry. And so what that means in practice is that the elasticity of the U.S. E&P sector is lower than what it has been in the past in terms of the reaction of incremental capex and incremental supply to a change in price. And at the same time, I think we need to ensure that we say that the response of OPEC Plus has also been less elastic than I think many people had expected. So on the way down, OPEC Plus was quick to adjust supply when demand was going off or was going lower. But of course, they've brought back some supply as prices have come back higher, but there's still ample spare capacity that could be brought to the market as well. And so there's an asymmetric response on OPEC Plus and a lower elasticity by the U.S. E&P industry to react to this higher price level. Now, the U.S. E&P industry is also not homogeneous. And I think we need to ensure that we say that they're publicly reporting E&Ps that are beholden to their shareholders. There are IOCs, including BP or ExxonMobil or Chevron, that have assets in the Permian that are taking a slightly different approach than the pure publicly reporting E&Ps. And then there are private E&Ps that are reacting to a higher price and have actually been the primarily responsible for the increase in rigs and drilling activity that we've seen over the last several months. So going forward from here, we are clearly going to see an increased amount of spending next year, but not as much as might have been seen in the past. And so the question comes back to, well, for every dollar that is spent in the shale patch going forward, can that be more efficient? Are the places that E&Ps are targeting more productive than they have been in the past? So we're still going to see growth next year, and including, at BP and some of our assets that we have in our BPX subsidiary, we will see some growth next year, but it will not be as much growth as might have been seen in past years because of that demand for capital discipline.
And also, I guess that's partly a legacy of what happened in 2014, between 2014 and 2016, when we had that 26% drop. And then again, last year, I think His Excellency was referring to it as that it would have been a bloodbath had they not taken action to cut supply of the OPEC Plus, and that it was a black day because of this sort of demand slump. But at the same time, we have this, we have the United States and we have President Biden with his green, policy and a ban on drilling on federal land. But when the price went up, a call on OPEC, well, not really a direct call, but basically indicating that maybe OPEC Plus should do more, contacting the Saudis. And it just seems as if, again, it's all part of this, the fact that the system is still not elastic enough. The energy system, the global energy system is not elastic enough. It can't really take shocks at the moment because it's stretched. It's still trying to manage to absorb this transition. And I think, again, His Excellency spoke of ammonia being difficult to transport, dangerous, about the fact that in the aviation industry, it's very difficult to find alternatives at the moment. And I think Christophe de Margerie, the CEO of Total, said it quite well. He said, I cannot go green without the black. I need the black to develop my green. And I think that's maybe something that's happening. Adam, you're shaking your head. Do you not agree?
No, I think that you're absolutely right. Ammonia is not that difficult to ship. I mean, people have been shipping ammonia for a long time in the chemicals business. The scale up that would be required, I think, is a different story. It's easier to ship ammonia than it is hydrogen, and that's why I think you saw that activity taking place. Kate, I think in many cases we have to begin to experiment with these new methods. We need demonstration projects. We need pilot projects all over the place to kind of figure out how to make this work. And I come back to it's going to be imperative that we try every tool in the toolbox to get to the Paris Agreement goals that have been agreed to. Oh, I think we'll hear more about that in Glasgow. I think that it's you mentioned, what will the national oil companies do, in an energy transition? I think the answer is, well, they need to become energy companies. And you're even seeing that in terms of how Total has renamed itself. Hydrogen is, one way to go. A lower carbon intensive oil itself is another way to go. Being in the biofuels business is a possibility. Making sure that looking for ways to use offsets under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement to provide airlines with fuels that they can use, or even biofuels. I mean, it's a way of doing that. I keep coming back to, we have to be really careful about how the transition is managed, or you're going to run into problems of affordability. And that's kind of what is happening now, as we go into the winter. The Sustainable Development Goal number 7 of the UN is making sure that there's clean, affordable, modern energy for everybody. And I think underscoring affordable in that is critical. And again, one of the ways to make sure of that is to have make sure that the transition to cleaner fuels is managed well enough to not create consumer backlash that Valérie was talking about.
Yeah, I'm in the country of the Gilets jaunes, and we might see more of them. I was actually going to say, it's sort of a related question from the audience, basically asking, with growing mainstreaming of ESG and capital markets, how do you see these factors impacting NOCs going forward? Valérie, maybe that one for you. The ESG elements and how it'll impact NOCs, and maybe Michael as well, because obviously ESG applies to everybody these days.
Yes, I mean, it's interesting because NOCs have always been interested in ESG for the most part, because, they have that national mission, as I call it, to say that they're meant to be responding to more than profit drivers. They're meant to be ensuring affordable, reliable energy for the population. They often have a broader social mandate of building skills and national capabilities. So, but you wouldn't call that CSR, and you wouldn't call their investment in their country ESG unless they turn to equity markets or listing, and then they have to play with the same vocabulary, the same rules, the same game as the international oil companies. And it can be a bit uncomfortable because if that's not what you've done in the past, it's difficult. And I think what they're finding is that when they do have to look for equity or loans, or, well, not like ring-fenced loans that are, that you don't have to convince anybody, but like oil-backed loans. But if you're actually looking for real capital, you have to have a convincing narrative on the transition, a convincing narrative on that you're not going to have stranded assets and that you can manage these new risks in a convincing way, because the markets are not going to invest in NOC projects without that. So I think that's a new discovery. There are quite a few NOCs that are partially listed or going to capital markets. And so I think they are being exposed to those new expectations. And I think it's a very good thing, because actually, if those questions aren't being asked by their shareholder at home, it's very good that someone else is asking them. How are you managing risks? How are you going to convincingly build your resilience to these changes? And so even basic thing like introducing carbon pricing into, like a shadow carbon price into all your decisions, I think internally it would be, already a step in the right direction.
And I think this is going to be for both of you later on. And Michael, one of the things that was really interesting when Iraq opened up for upstream investment was BP partnering with CNPC in Rumaila, which is, the biggest producing field in Iraq. And I was wondering whether that's something that we might see more of a trend. I know that BP has now restructured the joint venture so that it's sort of independent, but is that something that we might see more of, you think, or is there a need for the NOCs and the international energy companies to maybe pool their resources, bring the weight and the experience of the international energy agencies, or the IOCs, and the NOCs together, like we've seen in Iraq. We've also seen it with Total now. The newly established Iraq National Oil Company is going to be a partner, or one of its, one of the state companies. Is that something that is?
Yeah, I would say absolutely, and I think it raises another interesting point that I want to make, which is that I think NOCs need to see opportunity, increasingly see and identify opportunity in the transition. And that can be done via regulations that encourage measurement of flaring or measurement of venting. And then those NOCs can therefore say, well, if you want to partner with us or you want to invest in this country, then we're happy to ensure that the regulatory structures are in place to monetize that monetize that natural gas that may have been flared in a prior world, right? And I think that these kinds of partnerships between NOCs and IOCs needs to increase. And I think the harsh reality is that ESG, to go back to the question that was raised, is that ESG pressures, yes, they are first going to have an impact in equity markets and for issuers like ourselves, right? But increasingly, we are going to be asked, and companies like ourselves will be asked to ensure that if we're going to provide a scope 3 target or a target to include other emissions outside of just what we are operating, then we're going to need to bring our partners, many of which include NOCs, into that fold. And NOCs will be encouraged to as well be brought to a lower carbon pathway. And so I think, broadly speaking, we need to understand that there are two basic investment strategies. One is, okay, let's see how do we reduce the emissions from a particular portfolio. And so an investor, would sell the high emitting assets and then use other forms of portfolio engineering. You have you would short sell, or you'd buy green label securities, you'd buy offsets. So this is category one, right? Category two would be an alignment strategy. So investors would focus more on encouraging long-term decarbonization, encouraging us to reduce our emissions, creating a portfolio of a net zero aligned, of a group of net zero aligned assets that are more on a transition pathway that's credible, even if you have high emissions today. And I think we need to understand and make a distinction between the first strategy and the second strategy. The second strategy, an alignment strategy, is the only way that you're going to get a lower emissions result at the end of the day, right? If you're just going to focus on divesting, you're not necessarily going to get a lower emissions result. And so that means that, the ESG movement will increasingly have to ensure that disclosure requirements, that transparency will allow that alignment strategy to proliferate rather than just reducing the overall emissions in a portfolio. And the case in point, which I heard in a panel I was participating in last week, is that let's say you have an OFS company, an oil field services company, that is increasingly trying to sell e-fracs or electronic frac fleets to the rest of the E&P industry, right? If you were, based on the metrics today, judging that oil field service company, you would wrap it up and group it up into the oil field services industry and say bad, right? But in reality, they're selling e-fracs and enabling decarbonization across the entire value chain in the E&P sector. And so the fact that ESG investing still has to get to that next level to understand how that delivers on decarbonization goals means that we still have a lot more work to do in ESG investing to bring about the outcomes that we want.
You spoke about divestments. Yes,
I think that Michael made a really important point, and I'd just like to underscore it. And that's that right now the ESG tool seems to be very blunt, and it's not differentiating those aspects that the industry is pushing that actually are helping to lower carbon footprints. And many things could fall into that same category. Efforts to do direct air capture, carbon sequestration, so geologic storage of carbon, all of which is being done by the oil industry, which generally the ESG formula doesn't provide for them to be counted. And what Michael said earlier was that this is leading to investment funding drying up for some companies that could be exacerbating the shortage that we're getting, that's leading to the higher prices that we're faced in the near term. And so what I'm afraid of is that by not being careful enough in how we're doing this, we might actually reduce the appetite of consumers for taking the kinds of actions that Valérie was talking about earlier to actually get the job done. I mean, it's like you want consumers to be on your side in this, not complaining that prices are too high and they're so focused on the short run that they don't see the longer term benefits. Back to you.
Well, they are complaining here now about high electricity prices. They just don't understand it. When you sort of try to explain to them it's gas price at the margin, and that's really what's affecting the electricity price. It's not the fact that nuclear is sort of, one of the things that I also included in the paper, which I think is really interesting, it was a point made by Jason Bordoff, who I think is not with us today because he's doing something else with the IEA on World Energy Outlook Week. But he did say something about, there's no point marginalizing the IOCs or the international energy companies if you don't also tackle demand. And you did mention, Adam, that, in Saudi Arabia, and I know His Highness Prince Abdullah was one of the first to actually lead that energy efficiency drive in the kingdom many years ago, even before it was fashionable. But I do have a question, talking about NOCs. I mean, some of them are maybe a bit archaic and need to sort of move with the times and sort of structure themselves for this sort of new world. But we have a question from Yasar Maliki, and a question to Valérie. And he says that Iraq has reinstated its Iraq National Oil Company, which was disbanded in the 1980s. As OPEC's second largest producer, is Iraq going the right way, especially that NOCs are reinventing themselves and INOC seems to be taking a traditionalist approach to its rebirth, focusing on exploration and oil assets? Thanks.
Yes, it's a really interesting question. I think, it kind of wrapped up in that is it too late to create a new NOC? Is it the wrong focus to focus on oil? I think, in the case of Iraq, with the kind of production it has, there's a lot to keep it busy if it just focuses on oil. And if it were to focus on reducing emissions, of upstream operations, that would be a very positive contribution to the country of Iraq. I think the upstream is responsible for 8% of global GHG. So, it's a significant contributor. But then I guess, is it too late to start this off? I mean, I think that really depends on how well it's established and what incentives are given to it by the government. Is it established to focus on cost reduction and emissions reduction, or is it established to give jobs to people who are connected? It can become quickly a waste of time and resources, or it can become an avenue for building skills in those lowering emissions kinds of activities. But it shouldn't become a distraction for the efforts that the IOCs would be making in this area. But I think, the other perhaps issue to consider is that a lot of NOCs that are currently upstream focused, I think, are still thinking with the older mindset of taking stakes as the best way to generate revenues for the government through, the royalty tax and dividend system. And there is some question about how much risk you should take. If it's if it's not a carried stake and you have to put up the development costs and you have to put in that money, there's new thinking on the liabilities that are involved in that, and whether it's wise for an NOC to be always seeking to increase its stake in the ventures. There may be a more cautious approach that's warranted in this new era.
Thank you, Valérie. We don't have any questions from the audience, so I'm going to have to keep going on it. We haven't really talked about the this sort of move to decarbonize gas, LNG. I think Qatar sent a couple of cargoes, carbon neutral cargoes. Others are talking about it as well. Is that the future? And is this something that's going to be? Is there going to be a pull from the consumer side, from the consuming nations? And I think the IEA has raised doubts about the efficacy of these certificates. I mean, I suppose they need to be developed because it's early days yet. But again, gas is getting a bad rap because of methane emissions. I think, border taxes, if the EU introduces stricter ones. And I guess the solution is to strip the greenhouse gas emissions, lock them into some kind of product. But I don't think, again, have we put the cart before the horse? Are we investing too much in one side of the business before the infrastructure is ready for it? Or the infrastructure and the legislative framework, the governance framework of all these new types of, carbon neutral or decarbonized products? Anybody want to take that?
Let me just try to start in, Kate. That's one of the reasons why I think it's important that Article 6 of the Paris Agreement still gets attention in Glasgow. This allows for the trading of carbon, and I think that's going to be an important way to deal with the issue that you talked about. Methane, is how they say it in the States, is very, very important, and different countries and different companies have very different records on flaring and releases of methane, as Michael indicated. There have been a number of. It's actually getting harder and harder to hide that now because there are satellites that are tracking it. And I'm delighted to say that Saudi Arabia shows up very dark on those satellite pictures, which means it's got a very low level of both flaring and methane emissions. There are a number of efforts underway, I think, globally to try to look at methane. I think it's going to be very, very important. I think it has to be, it's like it should be done because I think that natural gas is still going to be needed as we move through the transition to cleaner fuels. And assuming that both biological carbon storage and geologic storage, direct air capture can be done affordably, then we can continue to use hydrocarbons like natural gas and oil in a responsible way. Final thought on this is that coming back to the idea of what you're trying to do is you're trying to control the emissions associated with climate change and warming, and that we have to start thinking of ways to do that don't penalize those countries who are just beginning to see their per capita use of energy rising. Back to you, Kate.
Thanks. Yes, no, I was going to say, you said that Saudi Arabia appears quite dark. Is that still going to be the case when they start developing the shale, the Jafurah shale gas? Because that's going to be, I mean, that's $110 billion project in Saudi.
And the question related to that was, I'm sorry.
You said that in terms of methane emissions.
Flaring and methane emissions. Yeah, that's basically under the control of the operator. And Saudi Aramco has always been, for a long time, through their gas operations, has been quite good at controlling that activity. And I don't imagine that that's going to change.
The other thing that hasn't really come up is we haven't really talked about the divestments by the NOCs. I mean, we've seen Aramco, we saw the IPO a couple of years ago. We're seeing them now offering, lease type arrangements for crude pipelines. ADNOC has been doing the same without really giving any equity to going public. I think Aramco stopped now. Is it going to be more difficult to dispose of non-core assets in order to generate revenues for the NOCs, Marcel, Valérie? Is it going to be harder for going forward?
I mean, I expect that we'll see a bit of, like a bifurcation of industry players, like the industry ecosystem that we knew until maybe 5 years ago, where you had the super majors, the independents, the international NOCs, and then the national NOCs, working at home. Is kind of now, I expect, going to be a bit redefined. Well, you'll see on the one hand, the companies that are listed and subject to pressure from investors and shareholders that are expecting ESG and avoiding stranded assets, expecting real focus on emissions reduction, even to scope 3. And then you'll have other players that'll be, the private companies that'll be the sort of cowboys, you'll have national oil companies that'll be scooping up some of these high emitting assets because they see that they can make a profit with it, and that the host government is amenable to increasing its emissions. So you may have a bit of a bifurcation of the industry in that way. I think, that being said, a lot of those assets will probably be stranded because those kinds of assets would probably be sold like to domestic market or regional market, and those will sort of be shrinking or retrenching geographically. So I think that it'll be harder to dispose of those assets with time. But I think I wanted to just come back to that question of the offsets, that we haven't completely talked that one out, I think, because there's a question from the audience about offsets and whether this would be something that could really affect the course of travel, I guess, and I think offsets. From my understanding, the market is still so small, and the offsets planned from just 2 oil companies, 2 oil majors, would flood it completely. And so, I don't think that is really so far been the sort of panacea that we might have hoped. But I think also a lot of the offsets are traded, and the country in which the offset project is carried out isn't being paid the full value of that offset. And that has to change. I think with NOCs being more involved in offsets, it could be more interesting for them to be delivering projects that are in the country's NDC pipeline of projects, projects that really improve the quality of life, quality of air, access to energy in the country, and also offset their upstream emissions. But it would be impossible to offset them all. But I think it's interesting how that market is evolving and where it could go. That could be perhaps more valuable.
Sorry, yeah. As you can see, I had to actually plug my computer in because it was dying. It's an old one. Yeah, no, and I think some people think, oh, well, offsets aren't really the solution because they allow some people to, just go on polluting. And, again, it's all a question of a system that needs to mature, right, to incorporate all these new elements that we're trying to bring in order to achieve net zero carbon neutrality. But yes, I had missed that question. So thank you for answering it. Anybody? Michael,
so Kate, on the offsets, I mean, I think Valérie is right, is that we have to get going on this. They have to be transparent, they have to be additional, and they have to be verifiable. No double counting. I mean, there's a long list of criteria, but I think that it's going to be critical to do this. Certainly, there's ample geologic storage capability here in the kingdom to store CO2, and so finding some way for customers to benefit from actions that they could take through this kind of thing would be really useful. I think you have to come back to experimenting and kind of getting on with it. I sometimes feel like we're letting the search for the perfect to get in the way of getting a lot of good done, and that just getting started is really important, and that again should allow for as many possible ways of accomplishing the task as can be invented. Back to you.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things you always hear when you talk to, people in the Middle East involved in the industry who say, we don't really have sophisticated financial instruments within the region that we can tap. But I'm interested in going back to Michael about you are at BP. BP was one of the first to announce, net zero target. And I was just wondering what it's like to sort of be living through this sort of transition within a sort of IOC that is transitioning to a net zero business. How does the corporate, how does your experience of it, having been in it now?
Thanks, Kate. So, the experience has been volatile, right? I think it's clearly been a very disruptive time for the industry as a whole, living through a pandemic and ensuring safety is of utmost priority, ensuring that we continue to drive increasing returns to our shareholders, providing them with targets both long-term and interim, and all of this is informed by a group that I'm a part of in strategy and sustainability that goes about suggesting core beliefs to the company. And those core beliefs include the energy system becomes more diversified, that fossil fuel share of total energy goes lower, that renewables and electrification increase, that the world becomes more interconnected, and upstream producers see lower rent going forward than we may have seen in the past, and that means that customers see more rent than maybe what upstream producers may have. So all of these core beliefs are the foundation of the pivot in our strategy, and I think the challenge in ensuring that we are able to continue to, as we say, perform while we transform, makes the case that we need to continue to have these legacy businesses to allow us to spend cash in the low carbon and zero carbon space. And the problem is that not all investors buy into that. Some do, a growing share do, and as these disclosure requirements and as increasing concerns by society to get onto a lower carbon pathway increase, then we believe that our strategy will win over the long run. But also we set out these 10 aims, a bunch of different aims to reduce our emissions intensity, our methane emissions, all of that. And in addition, trying to help the world get to a net zero pathway. We set this out in February of 2020, and the world has come a long way, and we've lived through a lot since that time, and investor demands are increased, societal demands are increased, and so we're optimistic about what can come from Glasgow, but we're also realistic that there are certain places in the rest of the world, including where we operate, that are not moving as quickly. And so what does this mean? It means that the strategy needs to be robust to a number of different outcomes. And we need to ensure that we can continue to deliver good returns across all of these different businesses that we have. And so, anyway, it's been an interesting experience, so to say, to say the least.
I can imagine. And we have been talking about this sort of, more electrification. And of course, there has been a lot more investment in renewables. 2020, I think that was. And I haven't really, I've got the numbers in front of me, but, there will be a much bigger share for renewables in electricity generation. I think it's up to 80% by 2050, according to the IEA. But we're still at 20% at the moment. I mean, how do we get to 100%? How do we get to the 80%? I mean, you notice that we seem to set a lot of targets, we miss them, and then we set higher targets for, whatever. I mean, look at the EU. We keep, it's a moving target with these net zero targets. And of course, it wasn't net zero at the time, but we've seen an acceleration, because of the Green Deal, because of the green recovery packages. Sorry, it's quite loud here. Is this the moment in time where we will see a sort of a surge? And with the sort of, there is also a youth movement, isn't there, with Greta Thunberg, who's led this drive, and I think a lot of young people listen to her. I was talking to somebody on the plane today, and she's saying, her children are and their friends are going vegan for environmental reasons, because they don't want to eat, meat and affect agriculture and all that goes with agriculture, because that's also an emitter of greenhouse gases. So I think we're seeing and of course it does have to come from the youth, who are the future. So are we seeing this? Is this our final hurrah? Is this the last window where we will see high oil prices, where the NOCs can actually generate revenues and then shift and move with the transition, maybe a little bit behind, but they have the cheap feedstock, they've got solar, they've got some wind. The minister spoke about a bit of geothermal, but maybe geothermal not exactly, might work in Iceland, but perhaps not so much in other places that are in the Gulf. So maybe a final word, is this the moment of reckoning?
Well, let me first. I'll volunteer to go first. You asked Michael what it felt like to be, at an oil company watching the transition. One of the things that I think that I'm back to the idea of not letting the perfect get in the way of the good. I don't think there's a perfect fuel. If you do sort of a full life cycle analysis of most fuels, you realize that there is no perfect fuel. The idea that somehow electric vehicles are massively better ignores the idea of how many minerals are going to have to be mined? How many tons of earth have to be moved in order to get the minerals that you need for batteries, for everything else? And the numbers are really big. I mean, if you have every vehicle in the world running on electricity, you probably don't have the minerals that you need to make the batteries for those vehicles to go. I won't say that it can't be done, because batteries can get better, and I'm a big believer that resources can be discovered if the prices are right and the technology improves. But it could be a very bumpy ride. So I'm back to the idea of, let's try to figure out what we can do now and get on with it. Methane control is one of those. Finding ways to use government things like procurement to pull low emission, low carbon technologies along. Finding ways to provide for finance, making sure that ESG investors are encouraged to do things to allow money to go into areas that allow the transition to happen smoothly is better than the kind of jerky and volatile environment that we're seeing now. So back to you, Kate.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned it, the technology. I remember Lord Brown, when he was CEO of BP, saying many years ago that we don't know today the technologies of tomorrow that might actually, transform the industry. And we're still saying it now, that there are technologies that haven't yet been developed that are going to help us achieve this net neutrality. Valérie.
Kate, some people say that things like direct air capture just aren't believable. There's even people that say green hydrogen seems, like very expensive. I'm not really sure that electric airplanes or airplanes flying on fuels other than jet fuel or biojet fuels are very believable. I think that we should get on with the experimentation, do enough pilot projects that we can drive the costs down in the same way that we drove costs down for solar panels, but do that across as many possible tools and pathways of achieving net zero as we can, trying not to be too prescriptive in how we get there.
We have 5 more minutes. So final word from Valérie, and then Michael, if you want to say something.
Yeah, thanks. I think, a lot of the comments that I've made were about reducing emission, how NOCs can clean up, oil production and gas production. But it's also really interesting to think about NOCs turning into national energy companies. And there is a risk that if countries don't think about this, they may end up being spoilers in the transition. They may be putting sticks in the wheels of the transition by just, making, creating incentives not for energy efficiency and not for decarbonizing your own national consumption. So I think it's something to consider. Every country would have a very different profile, and whether the state utility would benefit from a little competition from the NOC getting into renewables, or if it would be detrimental because the NOC is really ineffective. So something to think through. But I think we will see more NOCs maybe playing a more active role in this transition, and we'll see some that'll be spoilers, I think.
Yeah, I think we've seen Aramco get involved in solar recently.
It's been a bit more focused on cleaning up energy rather than becoming a renewable company, or they've left other players to handle that. But you do see it in other countries. So, but it's a new trend, I think.
Michael?
Yeah, just a couple points just to conclude. I think I couldn't agree more with what Adam said just recently, that this is a sort of all hands on deck problem. We need everybody at the table, including not only the green companies, but companies that are greening. and the sort of investment backdrop needs to allow for the rewarding of those companies that are looking to green. I think the other thing, just with respect to needing all hands on deck, is that the pandemic and our statistical review, which we published a couple months ago, showed we saw a 6% decline in carbon emissions in 2020. It was a very oily decline in overall emissions, and that has basically come right back up to levels that we were before. So that means we've lost a year in terms of the decarbonization pathway that we need. That 6% decline annually is the kind of decline we need to see every year for the next 30 years to get onto a Paris-aligned pathway. And so I mention this just because the chorus and the demand for change is only going to get louder. And we are hearing it at BP, and we hear all of this very loudly, and we are making changes as a result, and have been making changes. But it's only a matter of time before I think NOCs will also feel this pressure because of the industry that they are a part of. And so it's great to see many NOCs in the region, in the Middle East and elsewhere, that are starting to think about how to manage this. And so anyway, I think there are both challenges and opportunities in this transition. That's the other thing I want to just leave you all with.
I wanted to sort of follow up on what you said about the emissions. I mean, we are on track for the second highest emissions in modern times or post industrial revolution. And I'm just wondering why. Nobody was flying. A lot of people were off the roads. We were using more electricity, but there's more renewables in electricity than anywhere else. Why are we seeing this? Forget about what's happening now with coal coming back a little bit because people don't have enough gas or don't want to pay for the gas, don't want to pay current prices. But why are we seeing this rise in emissions?
So let's separate 2020 and 2021. In 2020, we saw a massive shock to mobility and a massive shock to economic growth. In 2021, the opposite direction. So economic growth rebounded, and we've seen people being averse to public transit or averse to flying, and in the United States at least, they're using their cars more. And so it's just a question of balance that's offset the increased amount of working from home and the traffic on the streets here, as in many other places around the world, as the economy rebounds, has been very emissions intensive. So just as much as it was emissions intensive on the way down in mobility, now those mobility metrics, and in addition, industrial metrics, are all moving the other direction, which leads to a higher emissions profile.
Okay, well, I'm going to thank you all very much. We're out of time, and I want to thank you again for joining us. I know it was a long session, but Raymond, over to you to close it up.
Great. Thanks so much, Kate. Thank you all for joining us. Special thanks to our speakers and our moderator for making the time to join us today and sharing their incredible insights. I'm happy that we were able to contribute to this important conversation. This is only, as we mentioned, day one of 3 days. So please do join us for session 2 tomorrow, 10 a.m. Eastern time, looking at the role of gas and renewable power generation in a carbon-constructed world. Videos from today's sessions will be posted on our website in the next couple of days. So do check our website at AGSIW.org for that and for Kate's paper and for more information on this conference as well. So thank you all again. Thank you to our speakers, and we'll see you again tomorrow.